Well, when you were 14, your mom moves the family back to Maryland, to Baltimore. And this is 1992, so this is sort of the crack era is still happening during this time. And I mean, I've been to a lot of, areas throughout my life, but I remember watching The Wire and then actually going to Baltimore and going like, wow, it really is like this. Like literally blocks and blocks of boarded up houses.
Yes.
So here you are, 14 years old, you're in this environment, and you talked about how you got involved in petty crime during this time. You started skipping school, your grades dropped. Remember there was a quote, you said, I had felt the possibility of death tickling my neck like the blade of a guillotine as long as I could remember. I feared that one day I'd be the one running from the gun or holding it. I also know what it's like to mourn the victims of violent crime.
That's right.
So during this time, what do you think was the most traumatic thing that you experienced in Baltimore?
Well, it was interesting because when I was 13 years old, because I was going through a lot of things when I was young, a lot of things that you just laid out. And my mother had been threatening me with military school ever since I was 8. She would get my report card. She'd be like, you got to be kidding me. And, she would hear about the things I was doing. She was like, I'm going to send you away. I'm going to send you away. I was like, Mommy, I know I'm going to work harder. And then I didn't. And, finally, when I was 13 years old, she came up to me and she was like, no, I'm really going to send you away. And I was like, I know, Mommy, I'm going to work harder. And she's like, no, you're going next week. And she then helped me pack my stuff up. And she drove me to Pennsylvania to go to a military school. And I remember when I first showed up at that military school, man, it was, I was literally letting them know, I was like, listen, this was a mistake. I'm not going to be here long. You don't have to waste your time on me. I'm getting things squared away right now, but I'm about to leave, so don't worry about me. Because I was like, I don't want to be here. And until I realized that everybody didn't want to be there, like all of us were sent. And we didn't have a choice either. And so I remember those first days, I ran away 5 times in the first 4 days. I just did not want to be in this place. And I would run through the woods and they'd find me and they'd bring me back to campus and I'd try to run away again. And in fact, the second to last time I tried to run away was because they actually drew me a map on how to get to the train station because it was so pathetic that I kept on getting lost. And the map was fake. The map literally took me to the middle of the woods. They just enjoyed watching a flashlight go all over the place. But it was during that time that I actually felt for the first time in my life, actually a connection where I felt like I had a chance to reinvent myself and I had a chance to be part of a team. And for the first time, I felt leadership. But you're right where something else was happening at the same time too, because when my mother moved back down and she moved down a place called Anne Arundel County and was working in Baltimore, I found the first place in my life that I actually felt like I could call home. And that was Baltimore. Because I finally found a place that I felt like it accepted me. I mean, I finally found a place where I was embraced, like flaws and all. And so I remember going out to, Drew Hill and go playing basketball over in Drew Hill, or going over to Conheads and go and get my hair cut, or hanging out over on Landvale and where all my friends were. Like Baltimore was a place that embraced me. And so I always felt like, I'm born down at Tacoma Park, was in New York, was in Pennsylvania. Like I moved around a lot, and not because of choice, but because of tragedy. But Baltimore was the first place in my life where I was like, this feels like home. I know this area. I know the streets. I know the people. This actually feels like home. And so that's why, I always say that Baltimore, I'm a Baltimorean by choice because I really felt that Baltimore helped shape me. And so when people say like, where are you from? It's always a complex question for me because like a lot of kids, I moved around a lot when I was young. But when people say, where's home? My answer is always easy. It's Baltimore.
Well, you go to Valley Forge Military Academy, you graduate, and then you go to Johns Hopkins.
Yeah.
And while you're at Johns Hopkins, you become the first Black Rhodes Scholar in the history of Johns Hopkins, which basically gives you a scholarship to go to Oxford University.
Yep. It's crazy. They literally pay you. They pay for everything. They pay for your flights. They pay for all your food. They pay for your travel. They pay for everything. It's they select 32 Americans every single year, and only 32 Americans throughout the entire country every year to go study at Oxford. And they say the only thing that we ask, there is no bill. The only thing that we ask is that you learn and then contribute and serve when you come out. It was amazing.
Well, yeah. And for those that are watching this that don't know how big of a deal this is, Oxford is essentially the Harvard of Europe. Or you could say that Harvard is the Oxford of America. It's that big of a deal.
And it's wild because, I remember I first heard about it because one of my mentors is the former mayor of Baltimore, a guy named Kurt Schmoke. And I was interning with him. And during the final day of my internship, he called me into his office and asked me how it was. And I said, it was great. And he said, listen, I'd like for you to apply for the Rhodes Scholarship. And he said, have you ever heard of it? And I said, I'd heard of it because I knew he was one. But I was like, but I hadn't thought about it. And he said, I really want you to apply. And remember, when we're talking about, when people say who are Rhodes Scholars, the answer is like Bill Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar. Cory Booker was a Rhodes Scholar. Pete Buttigieg was a Rhodes Scholar. Gina Raimondo, the Secretary of Commerce, was a Rhodes Scholar. So like, what it did was it opened me up to a world that I honestly didn't even realize existed. It allowed me to have opportunities and experiences that I never knew were real. But I think one of the things that really helped to do for me was, I was a kid I was the only person that year who graduated from a 2-year college before going to Johns Hopkins. I was definitely the only kid in my class who had handcuffs on their wrists. You know what I mean? But it reminded me, and it's the same thing I now remind all of the young people who I'm interacting with, is like, you're never in a room you don't belong in. You're never in a room because of someone's kindness or someone's benevolence. You're never in a room because of a social experiment. You're never in a room because someone wanted to sprinkle diversity into the room. Every room you're in that room because you belong there. And you're in that room because that room would be incomplete if you weren't there. And that was one of the things that I think the Rhodes Scholarship really didn't just help to illustrate to me, but it really helped to fortify in the way that I view my space in the world.
Well, you get your master's degree at Oxford in 2004, but then in 2005, you get deployed by the Army to Afghanistan.
Yeah.
82nd Airborne Division. While you're out there, did you experience any warfare at all or no?
Oh, yeah. It was actually amazing because I remember before we went out, there were, I think, about 150,000 troops in Iraq. And I think there were only about 17 or 18,000 troops in Afghanistan. So when we got orders that we were going to Afghanistan, a lot of people were like, woof, at least you're not going to Iraq. Because at that time, Iraq was the thing that everybody was talking about. That's where you had some of the hardcore warfare that was going on. And so I remember when we got initial orders for Afghanistan, there was in some cases and some ideas like a bit of a sigh of relief that it's like, well, Afghanistan's not the hot spot, Iraq is a hot spot. Until you get over there. And then you realize that it just wasn't being covered in the same way. And I think we saw what happened a couple years later when they did that surge to Afghanistan. But the reason they did it was because the amount of fighting that was on in Afghanistan that people just did not realize what was going on. And it was amazing because as you get to Afghanistan, you see a place that is one of the most visually beautiful places I've ever been to on the globe. But a place that, it was so gorgeous, man. It was like, because there's no light pollution, the stars literally feel like they're like sitting on your head. They're so close to you. And it's beautiful. It's also a place that has been in a constant state of war for 30 years, a sporadic state of war for hundreds of years. And for many of the Afghans who we met and who we were serving with, they were just kind of like, whether it was the British or the Russians or the Americans, the only thing they were used to was somebody was in our country. Somebody was there to fight. And whether it was a British flag or a Russian flag or an American flag on their shoulder, they kind of just got used to the idea that somebody else was coming over to the country. And so the challenge of being over there, and we were actually on the border of Afghanistan and Pakistan, a place called Khost, which was the former home of the Taliban and where Al-Qaeda had their outposts. You kind of realized from your very earliest days that this was not going to be a quiet deployment. But I got a chance to serve with and see some of the greatest moments of heroism that I've ever seen in my life.
Okay, so you get done with your deployment, then you come back to the U.S., and you actually became a White House fellow for Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice.
Yeah.
Do you think that really changed you in terms of your political goals at that point?
Not really. It was wild because I remember I just come back from a mission, actually, when I was over there. And one of my deputy brigade commander was actually a former White House fellow. He was a major at the time. Now he's actually a 3-star general. And he said, listen, I want you to apply for the White House fellowship. And kind of similar situation. I was like, I'd heard of it, but I didn't really know much about it. And he said to me, I really think it's important for you now. You've now just spent the year learning how policy is implemented. It's important that you go back now and see how policy is made. And that's really what the White House Fellowship allowed me to do. I think there were 14 of us. And so these 14 people, mid-career professionals, then went to the White House, and it was it's a nonpartisan fellowship, but you then go serve as a senior advisor to people in the administration. And for me, I got placed with the Secretary of State, which was Secretary Rice. And it was interesting because she has since become a really important friend and mentor to me. And the thing I always say about her is you can disagree with her conclusions on things, but you always respect her process. Like, she's a very thoughtful person. And I think there's a lot of people who frankly make policy off of nonsense and with no information at all. She's not one of those people. And the other thing I really respected about her was she was genuinely curious about my opinion, because she's like, you just came out from the battlefield. You just came out serving with one of the most elite units in the entire Army. You just came out here and seeing what was like on the front lines. She's like, I can talk to 4-star generals all day long. I'm the Secretary of State. She's like, I actually want to talk to the captain, the person who was a lieutenant and got a battlefield promotion, right? What was your perspective? What was the perspective of your soldiers? Because my perspective wasn't the larger geopolitical manifestations of movements and operations. My perspective was, what was Joe experiencing on the ground? And so that's why I didn't just enjoy the process of working with her in that way. And my focus is on like foreign aid and foreign assistance and how the United States can use foreign aid in a way to be able to leverage influence and support people overseas. But I really did respect the approach that she took to me personally and the contribution that she hoped that I would make going forward. And it was also my first real exposure in that way of seeing how government kind of works, and in some ways how government doesn't work.
Well, right, because this was when George W. Bush was president.
Right. That's exactly right. And you see also just sometimes there's that very real disconnect between the policies that are being made and the policies that are being implemented. There is a very real, the policies that people can put in place, sometimes there are unintended consequences. Sometimes things happen that you did not intend to happen. That's just the way policy works sometimes. And I think being able to have the ability to bridge that gap between the policies that are made and how it impacts people on the ground are not just two really important things to hopefully meet, but it's important to recognize that sometimes they don't.
Okay, so you leave the White House and then you switch gears, you become an investment banker for first Deutsche Bank and then Citibank.
Yeah.
Knowing what you know about the banking world, as well as you being a governor, what's your stance on reparations for Black Americans who are descendants of slaves? Are you for it, against it?
Well, no, I think there's no way you can look at where we are right now and think we don't need reparative action, because there's still consequences of things that we are facing from back then. I mean, for example, I think you take a look at the racial wealth gap that we have in this country, right? where right now in my state, there's an 8-to-1 racial wealth gap in the state of Maryland. We don't have an 8-to-1 racial wealth gap because one group is working 8 times harder, right? We have a racial wealth gap because we had things like, you had things like unfair appraisal values in historically redlined neighborhoods. You have a racial wealth gap because of the Homestead Act. You have a racial wealth gap because of an unfair application of the GI Bill. We have a racial wealth gap because we have racist procurement policies that were in place that kept Black-owned businesses and minority-owned businesses from being able to participate. And so I am a big believer that the only way that you are going to address broken policies is actually by coming up with better ones. And so, for example, you take a look at what we're doing here in Maryland. And since I've been the governor, I've been very clear. We have a real focus. I want Maryland to be the first state that eliminates the racial wealth gap. And it's not because it only helps one group. I tell people, I want to do this not because I'm the only Black governor in the country. I want to do this because I'm really good at math, right? The racial wealth gap has cost this country over $16 trillion in GDP over the past 20 years. That's not GDP of a group. That's GDP. And so if you're able to eliminate a racial wealth gap, you're actually going to have a growing economy. So it's not about told you so, or it's not about, make me whole. It's about, I want our economy to grow. That way that everyone can benefit. So take a look at what we're doing right now in our state, where we've been able to address things like housing, because housing is one of the greatest determinants and greatest builders of wealth that we have in our society. We just passed in Maryland the most thoughtful, the most aggressive, and really the largest housing package in the history of our state that we just passed in our last legislative session, providing capital to first-time homebuyers, providing capital to minority businesses and minority developers to be able to have enhanced development, being able to incentivize transit-oriented development, being able to incentivize density bonuses in places that we can build, we should build, and we should incentivize building, and giving more people to become homeowners. The reason wealth becomes so important is because this now gives us an opportunity to pass something off to our children besides debt. It gives us an opportunity to be able to own more than we owe. And so how are we using that to create wealth? Just this past year, we've had complete adjustments on our state procurement policies because we had a goal when it came to participation for MBEs, minority-owned businesses, that our state never hit. And so now we've done away with things like these arbitrary waivers that we continue to give to these repeat offenders who kept on getting government contracts, but not having minority businesses connected and attached to it. That we're able to do things, provide additional capital to minority-owned businesses, Black-owned businesses, Black entrepreneurs, that we've actually been able to alter our education system to make sure our young people are learning how not just to be employees, but how to be employers. So my point is this: I'm focused on eliminating this racial wealth gap. And I want to do it by breaking up these systems that have allowed it to exist in the first place and actually putting together policies that focus on long-term sustainable wealth creation, home ownership, business development, entrepreneurship. I want people owning things. And that, in my opinion, that's going to be the key to long-term economic growth. And that's why I think I'm really excited about the direction that Maryland's going in to be able to address it.